streaming yet? Are people watching me doing this? Good, good. If everyone, and we'll be live streaming shortly.
Do you want us up?
Yes, please.
In this order?
I don't mind what order we're in. I put us in alphabetical, so sit wherever you would like. Do you want us to actually sit in order?
No, not for. Oh yeah. You're moderating. Yeah, so let Holly stay there. But other than that,
you could convince everybody else to sit that way. Yeah. I just put it in alphabetical order. I shouldn't put myself in order.
Should think of yourself.
It'll be 4 women and 2 dudes in this scenario.
Good morning and progress.
Should we swap?
That's fine.
Does look a bit weird.
Maybe. Should I follow my?
No, you stay there. I reckon we'll just have a.
Sit up. Like just sit wherever.
I'm going to try to sit under your face.
But
then we'll be running
Cause a
one
problem.
Right, yeah, we are like very close. Okay, a little bit so that I'm not twisting my neck. Okay, that's perfect.
Okay. And I will.
Thanks. Yeah,
But you don't have a mic in front of you, so you do.
Okay. Oh, no, I don't.
Roll the video. Pretty close. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us so early. I'm sure you're either here for the free breakfast or because you work with one of the people on stage. So appreciate you guys getting up early, but really critically, we have some people joining us from Australia via the live stream. So thank you kindly to the Australian government for doing that. And of course, if anyone wants food, it's up the back. Please don't hesitate to go and grab it. So I'm really delighted to be here this morning to talk to you all about workforce development, which is something that anyone in Australia knows that I can't stop harping on about. Dan, not in Australia, also knows I'm mad keen on jobs and skills. But we've got a really killer lineup this morning because we want to talk about how we can't get to net zero emissions if we don't have enough appropriately skilled people. And fundamentally, there's some big numbers that Dan will go into later. That's 17 million people globally between now and 2030. In Australia, it's 2 million more people. Out to 2050, it's quite a lot of people. So really critically, if we don't have enough people, we can't get to net zero emissions. And probably even more critically, if we don't have enough people caring about women and diversity, equity and inclusion, we definitely can't get enough people on the ground. So from the far stage left or right, I don't know enough about stage directions, but on my far left, stage left, we've got Dan from the International Energy Agency. Next to him, we have Kushla from the Australian Government. We've got Kane from the Clean Energy Council. All, obviously, Kushla and Kane are in Australia, my compatriots. Dan's based in Paris, but working for an international organisation. We've got Joanna from the Women in Renewable Energy group in Canada. And last but not least, we've got Lisa from the Business Council for Sustainable Energy in the US. So we're going to jump right in to a pretty nerdy discussion about how we can get enough people into the workforce across the whole clean energy sector, being renewables, efficiency and electrification. Of course, that Careers for Net Zero video that we just showed is about getting enough people across the whole clean economy, because we don't just need people in renewables and energy management, we also need people working in carbon removals and circular economy, not just to get us to net zero emissions by 2050, but to get us to negative emissions thereafter. So, to kick us off, I'm really keen for everyone to say what your organisation is and why you care about workforce development. And Dan, I'm going to pick on you first.
Happily. Hi, Dan Wetzel here with the International Energy Agency. Why the IEA cares about this. First, we started doing a bit of work called the World Energy Employment Report a few years ago. This tracks energy employment by subcategory, by region, globally. And we just really believe that without the skilled workforce of tomorrow, this could be one of the binding constraints for the clean energy transition, and also managing a just transition is going to be critical for political buy-in and enduring progress there. So this is really the IEA's key focus there.
Love it. Over to you, Kushla.
Thanks, Holly, and welcome everybody to the Australian Pavilion as well. Pretty self-evident, I think, as well, for the Australian government. You know, we know you need the people to do the work, and we will not achieve any of our goals without it. But I think you know, it goes deeper than that. It is about, I meet a lot of young people at these, at COPs back in Australia, and think about jobs that matter and jobs you can have a real impact. People are dealing with hard things, but it's incredibly positive as well from that perspective. And I think the other part, and it's not just one for one, but the just transition question is still a really big one, and so we've got to think about that as well.
Thank you, Kushla. Over to you, Kane.
Thanks, Holly. So, look, as the peak industry body for Australia, I mean, it goes without saying we need an enormous workforce to be able to deliver what we need to. The Australian government is committed to a target of 82% renewables by 2030. We can do that. It's an ambitious target, but we can do that as an industry. But to do it, we need people. And, we're already seeing across different parts of the supply chain and the sector some real constraints as far as the workforce. And I think discussions like this and the initiatives that industry, government and our partners are taking are absolutely critical so that we've got the workforce to be able to deliver the projects we need, but also to really reach into some of those areas, as Kushla highlighted, drawing in young people, giving them an opportunity from First Nations people, women, etc., other parts of the community that are not well represented in the sector in Australia at the moment. We know we've got work to do.
And I think we've got work to do around the world. So, Joanna, what does WIRE do, and why do you care about workforce development?
First and foremost, I just want to thank Australia for hosting me here, and WIRE, my baby daughter, as I like to call her. WIRE's mission is to advance the role and recognition of women and underrepresented groups in the energy and climate sector. We have a lot of different programs within WIRE, which is very relevant to, again, workforce development, whether it's the speed of mentorship that we bring decision makers with students and emerging professionals, whether it's the speed interviewing that we do with the GEs of the world, as well as the Siemens, where we're able to shortlist the HR hours, are able to employ very quickly and retain. We have a lot of different programs, obviously. I'm an individual of action, so to me, talk is cheap, and I definitely want to see results from this COP. I think that we're on a great path. I think that workforce development is really required, especially with skilled trades. Skilled trades is required to be able to build infrastructure. I'm partnered with a lot of different organizations, not only from the Canadian side, because even though we're an NGO in Canada, we certainly are global, as I put it, be global but act local. So we certainly are now in 9 different countries and growing. The goal is world domination and then to destroy WIRE, because I'm hoping never to have this continuous discussion. But in the meantime, I really want to support women and underrepresented groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And round us out pretty please, Lisa.
Yeah. Global domination at 8 a.m. I love it. No, and actually I think I'll count this as my first official trip to Australia. Look forward to being with all of you at a COP in the future, right? Now, Business Council for Sustainable Energy, we're very similar to the Clean Energy Council. We represent businesses and trade associations very broadly in the clean energy sectors. This is, when you sit in any leadership table and you ask, what keeps you up at night to CEOs in our sectors, they're going to say a few things, but workforce is usually one or two. We work a lot on policy advocacy, and really interestingly, in the last couple of years, the policies at the national level have not only done amazing things to drive investment and deployment, they've also embedded in it workforce development. So we're in a very unique time in the United States, and I would say North America. We have a North American energy system, and we're very focused on helping our members expand the programs that they're currently doing, and also just helping others, especially small and medium-sized businesses, understand how they can grow in these sectors and access workers themselves.
Awesome. This is, as you can see, there's diversity of interest in this space. So I work for the Energy Efficiency Council. For those of you not familiar with the Energy Efficiency Council, we're the Clean Energy Council's sister organisation. Indeed, we do both work in clean energy. We're just on the demand side. And critically, we're super aware in Australia that we need the same people. Obviously, we both need electricians and engineers, as does everyone around the world, but we need policy advisors, we need project managers, we need community engagement advisors, and that is not just for rolling out all of the renewables, it's also for ensuring that our homes and our buildings are healthy and comfortable, that we're reducing that demand. And it is also for ensuring that the rest of the emissions reductions happen as well. So there's a lot to unpack here. Just transition is obviously a big thing at COP all the time, but the reality is that workforce development and jobs and skills is something that gets a lot of lip service, to Joanna's point. There's a lot of talking about it, there's often not a lot of action. So we're really keen to unpack what are the opportunities, what's going well around the world. But to kick us off, Dan, I suspect there's not that many people that are super familiar with the World Energy Employment Report. You've just released the second one. There's nerds like me and Anita at the Clean Energy Council that happily read it every year. But what are the key findings, and what do we need to do to make sure we've got enough people to deliver net zero emissions?
Perfect, absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to just plug this report. So, so the World Energy Employment Report, how this started was realizing that globally there wasn't a clear picture of how many people work in what parts of the energy sector. And we know that these numbers are very helpful for advocacy, but we also know that it can be misused, where the job losses are going to be so big, or the job numbers are going to be so many that we're going to have ourselves a labor shortage. And we really wanted to make sure that we were honing in and getting these numbers right. So we track this by subsector, and I encourage you to look into the report. So if you have a particular lens, whether you're a wind company saying, what are the challenges wind is facing, what are the skills needed, what is the outlook for labor up to 2030, our report will cover all of that. So I encourage you to dive in there. The key area we wanted to focus is we know that the last 3 years were very turbulent, both in energy and in labor markets. So we really wanted to understand what has changed from pre-pandemic till now. And what we found is that energy jobs are up by almost 2 million people. Almost all of this growth is from clean energy globally. So actually fossil fuel employment remains down below pre-pandemic levels, and all of this growth has come from clean energy. And these have come from 5 sectors in particular. This is solar PV, EVs and their batteries, critical mineral mining, heat pumps, and then also new innovative technology like electrolytic hydrogen and things like CCUS. So, and wind, if I didn't mention that in there. So these are sort of the key sectors that are driving this. Additionally, when we look out to the horizon in 2030, we look across multiple scenarios at the IEA. We have our stated policy scenario that says, under today's trajectory, if no new policies were made, no huge outcomes were implemented in concrete policy, what would happen? And also we look at what would need to happen in a 1.5 degree scenario. And one of the key findings is across any of the IEA scenarios, clean energy or energy jobs grow to 2030, and that clean energy job growth outweighs those losses in fossil fuel across the board. And this is because there's a ratcheting up of energy investment globally as we're trying to move this transition. So I think that's one thing, is everyone's always concerned about what's going to happen in terms of the overall job balance. We see pretty resolutely, and the numbers are clearly with one direction, not sort of like on the margin, that we're heading in that direction. And this actually is where most of the report focuses this year, is where are we seeing this becoming a binding constraint for the transition. And we surveyed 160 global energy companies, and many of them said they were seeing more difficult times having to hire, having to raise wages well above inflation, which is a good thing for workers, but also can be a pinch for some of these industries as well that are trying to really compete on costs. And so we're seeing that all aspects of this are really coming together in terms of the labor component of this. In particular, when we want to look at this, is I think a lot of the conversation focuses on STEM degrees and the need to be able to ramp that up more. We do need to ramp that up. They're not more people are, the rate in which people are going into STEM is not keeping pace with the demand for those, but more people are going to STEM globally and in most key regions today than they were 10 years ago. Where we're very concerned is in vocational degrees. And so things like electricians, carpenters for energy efficiency retrofits, mechanics, installers, et cetera. This we see in pretty much all major economies, a flatlining of these trades, using the Australian term. And so we see that flatlining, but also in major economies like China, we see it actually falling 10% over the last 5 years. And this has been a real marked challenge where these are the careers that are going to have to be growing the most. And so when we look at places like the US with the IRA, a key focus of this is apprenticeships. How do we draw more people into these trades? And there's a lot of detail in the report on some of the stopgap measures that many of the industry is employing to get people into that. And this is even buying out whole roofing companies in the case of solar, where they're saying, we cannot get the workers we need, so we're just going to take them from another part of the economy, and all of these parts of the economy are already facing shortages. So you're going to start getting a lot of competition over a limited set of skilled workers. And so this is where we're looking in the future, is really understanding and defining job by job or sector by sector, what are the occupations needed and what are the skills needed? Because this, I think, really parlays into the conversation that labor ministers need to have, education needs to have to move the needle.
Thanks so much for that, Dan. I think it's really critical. What you're talking about here is a real need for good quality data, so we know where people are working, what jobs they have. Obviously thrilled that heat pumps is creating lots of employment and that it is diversity across the whole clean energy sector in terms of jobs. There is a program that is, of course, always referenced in the World Energy Employment Report that exists in the US, Lisa, called the US Energy and Employment Report, which is like gold standard for jobs data around the world. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what the US ER is, Lisa, and why it's so useful for supporting workforce development in the US?
Well, thank you. And a lot of the trends that you just described are mirrored in the most recent U.S. Energy Employment Report. So I think this report probably started about 10 years ago, and it was in our Department of Energy, so it was done by our national government. And for just the same reasons that you said, we could see these industries moving. We wanted to understand better what that was doing to employment, both to kind of respond to what we could perceive as further growth in the sector and, would we have the workforce we would need, but also just tracking now economic development in many parts of the country. So the report's gotten a lot more sophisticated than it was in the beginning as we've learned about these different nuances in the sector. So now just last March, the most recent U.S. Energy and Employment Report was released. And so it does year on year, but then longer term trends. And one thing that I would say wasn't highlighted as much, but I'm sure is very similar, is the role of energy efficiency jobs, something near and dear to you. I think for me, since the report started, one of the most key things that we have seen is the domination of energy efficiency jobs. So let's just say at the end of 2022, we had 8 million energy jobs. And I think that actually is a very important point. This is not just a clean energy jobs report. This is an energy sector jobs report in all its subsectors. But you can then parse out, which we do, where are our industries and how do we track against the sector overall. So energy efficiency has been the largest provider of jobs. And these jobs are in every corner, every community of our country, and they can't be outsourced. So before the pandemic, we were about 2.2 million energy efficiency jobs, and we've nearly gotten back there. We're not 100% there. And overall, clean energy jobs, broadly defined, are about, mirroring, again, there were about 3.1 million clean energy jobs in the United States at the end of 2022. So we're improving dramatically. And, certainly energy efficiency is showing its prowess. And there, too, I think there's a lot of myths about those jobs. I mean, we did an analysis about 3 years ago to track all the different qualifications in a clean energy job. And a lot of people think of them as engineers and very technical jobs. But it's everything. It's social media manager. It is project manager. It is, you know, a whole host of jobs you wouldn't think. We had over 100 classifications of clean energy jobs. So there's really something in there for everybody, and it's really exciting.
It is super exciting, and it isn't just STEM at all, which is a really similar story in Australia. So Kane, in October, our organisations, the Clean Energy Council and the Energy Efficiency Council, released a really big campaign. And the reason we did that is learning from the US EER and indeed from the research coming out of the IEA, we're going, we've got a problem. We don't have enough people. You know, yes, people think about jobs and clean energy. They think about rooftop solar installers. But even in pure renewables, you need wind blade technicians, you need project managers, you need community engagement advisors. It's so much broader than that. Can you give everyone a bit of a sense of what Careers for Net Zero is, and indeed what we were calling for as part of that? Because we indeed do want something like an Australian energy employment report, but what's the purpose of the campaign and why do we care about it?
Yeah, thanks. And I should recognise the Energy Efficiency Council. We obviously deliver that campaign and continue to in partnership. I think picking up on Lisa's point, this isn't just about renewable energy, as much as sometimes that's my bias. And I think, Lisa, to your point, I mean, I think we're on a journey. We're in awe of, you know, I think what the US has been doing, and I think particularly around the data, and probably linking both your comments and Daniel's in, really we're on a journey in developing a much stronger understanding of the current workforce, future needs, and what that gap is. You have to do that as a first step to then understand what are your priorities and how do you plug it. Holly, yeah, I mean, look, it was a fantastic campaign that's kicked off to really, I guess, bring to light and help people understand what those jobs and pathways are for the future. I know I don't know whether this is used in Canada and elsewhere around the world, but often used in terms of the opportunity for women, but you can't be what you can't see. And so part of the purpose of this was for us to identify 10 of those future careers and to really, I guess, showcase them and highlight them and give people an opportunity to understand what they were. To Lisa's point, they're not just, you know, wind turbine blade technicians. There's a whole diversity of those career opportunities, and to really be able to showcase them so that people, no matter where they were across the workforce or the economy, they could see and identify a role that perhaps isn't that far away from where they are now, or they can see a pathway for how they go from where they are now into those careers. So that's a campaign that's kicked off. It's continuing to really bring that to light. I guess the other element, so we engaged, it was 78, it might be more than 78 groups now, Holly?
78 organisations signed a joint statement, but we have well over 80 that have since supported the campaign.
So, I mean, obviously broad support, broad support really from across so many other organisations and sectors, and, you know, I guess we see them as critically important. They've all got something to add and are a part of this pretty complex jigsaw puzzle. The other things we were calling for were around data and that baseline information. We're on a journey, but many of the points that Lisa made ring true. Expanding the National Energy Workforce Strategy, picking up your points about the other sectors and opportunities, make sure we're understanding them, and then ultimately funding the implementation. There's a lot to do. I'm sure we'll come back to this. There is a lot to do, and ultimately we need to do more than look at the data, understand the gaps and talk about them, but we need to roll up our sleeves and get cracking. I'm sure we'll come back to plenty of those examples.
Well, I'm about to pick on Kushla. So back in October in Australia, a report came out from Jobs and Skills Australia, which sits under our Department of effectively workforce. And nevertheless, this isn't Kushla's area, but this giant report is called the Clean Energy Generation, and it basically says what do we need in terms of jobs and makes a bucket load of recommendations of how we can actually get there. And of course, our joint statement that the CEC and the EEC led said, hey, this is great, can you make sure you do all of that? But Kushla, can you give us a bit of a sense of what the recommendations are from the report and what the Australian government's planning to do to support the growth of the clean energy workforce?
Thanks. I think the fundamentals though, and it just does go to all of the issues and some of the complexities, but it is about, okay, what's the next best thing you can do? You should have been doing this 10 years ago, but if you weren't, where do we go now? So before we go into the details of that report, just to step through some of the things that the government has done. So there is a new energy apprentices program that was launched in January, this year. So that's about 10,000 new apprentices. So we sort of know that that's a gap. I think what you'll find is if these things work, the government is hungry to do more. So that's I think a really positive sign. The other fundamentals is, where there's immediate shortages, there's going to be questions for companies and what they do, but a government is responsible for understanding, as we're saying, the trends, where do we need to go. So I think it's also incredibly positive that the new National Skills Agreement, so this is the agreement that happens between the federal level of government and our states. So this was announced just in October. But it's $12.6 billion for vocational education and training, and that they have identified priority skills area in the energy sector trades. So that sort of hardwires it in a way that isn't just about, well, what's that program? That's, like institutional change. And then the other areas, there are TAFEs, Centre of Excellence, and then sort of going back to the report, and I won't step through all of those recommendations, but it kind of goes, well, what's in the general policy area, and what is it that you have to do that's for the clean energy, energy efficiency area? So I guess that's where our department or our minister has a responsibility, committed to develop a national energy workforce strategy, but that is also about coordinating across different levels of government. Because again, a lot of these things actually sit at a state level, and what the federal government does, big dollars in terms of what can come through National Skills Agreement, but more fundamentally, how do you set those systems up? So again, we're rushing pretty hard on a whole lot of fronts, but I think to do that well, that consultation engagement will play out over the next little while.
I, for one, am very much looking to that National Energy Workforce Strategy, as are a few other nerds around the room. I think one thing also that the Australian government committed to at COP 2 years ago in Glasgow is equal by 30, and it's been really great to see under the new, well, I shouldn't say new government, now halfway through a term, but the current government in Australia, the Labor government, is they have moved quite heavily on a lot of tertiary spaces, particularly the vocational area, but a critical thing that the former Australian government supported was equal by 30, and it's definitely been wholeheartedly embraced by the current government. Joanna, equal by 30 is something that WIRE is super involved in. Can you give everyone a bit of a sense of what equal by 30 is and why your organisation cares so much about it?
Of course. So equal by 30 is equal pay, equal opportunity, and equal leadership for women by 2030. We're in 2023. 2024 is around the corner. We need to reach 2030 to make this successful. The Canadian government has done an excellent job marketing and promoting, getting the signatories, not only from the Canadian, but on a global scale. I think that it resonates with a lot of individuals globally as well. And working closely with the Canadian government as well, I want to make sure that we are gaining as much signatories. It's not only, this is not lip service, there's action towards this. For instance, and I heard the panelists talk about, STEM. My background, I'm not an engineer whatsoever. I used to actually build wind energy projects for a living. And back when I started after university, I was applying to jobs I had no business applying for, the CEO levels. I was like, okay, well, and I'm not the type of person that needs to check every box, and that's something that I also tell women and underrepresented groups. When you look at a job description, you don't need to check every single box. And, and believe it or not, the reason that I actually became a wind developer, commercial wind developer, was because of my language skills. So to your point, Holly, there's a plethora of different types of jobs out there, from skilled trades to geologists, archaeologists, stakeholder relations, communications, marketing. We need all hands on deck to be able to get to that transition for net zero. I think that only together can we actually do this. We can't sit in silos. We need to really work together to make that successful. So going back to the Equal by 30, Annette Hollis and the team back in Ottawa have done such a great job promoting this. And for WIRE, what that means, which is very dear and near to my heart, is that people, organizations, companies, charities, and so forth are actually signing to this and executing towards that plan. And, I think that what's very important as well is that for women, the fact that, again, there's struggles into applying for certain jobs, I really, really push women to make sure that they're applying. As well as, going back to the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, of course, we have to start that conversation at a young age, because once you're in high school, and going into the academias, I think that is a little bit lost in translation. We're very much focused, of course, on skilled trades, because without skilled trades, we're not going to be building infrastructure. So anyhow, I do want to just recognize, and hats off to, Equal by 30, because again, if you haven't signed up, you're a little bit late to the party.
But we'll still take you.
But yes, exactly. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I think this is a really fair point. Like, when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, right now, the vast majority of people in the room that decided to get up early are women. A bunch of those women were like, we want to be here to support other women. We, of course, made sure that we had more women than men on this panel. And critically, things like the Careers for Net Zero campaign, we've got 10 champions, and they're very diverse people in lots of different ways. We've got a First Nations Australian, we've got a child of an Iranian refugee, we've got a person with a disability, and we've got 6 women, because you can't be what you can't see. And that's definitely something, Kane, that the Clean Energy Council is really committed to. Similarly, in October appeared to just be a bonanza month for getting stuff done. You released the Power Playbook, and the Power Playbook had a bunch of different recommendations for the Australian government of what they needed to do to actually get us to 82% renewables by 2030, but there is a section on workforce development that's really talking about making sure that we have a diverse and skilled workforce. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what the CEC believes we need to do to ensure that we have that skilled and diverse workforce?
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, October was a big month. Power Playbook, 45 recommendations, and it's worth noting they're not recommendations just for the federal government. These aren't all challenges just for the federal government to lead on. It is a genuine partnership, I think, with industry, with other parts of the community, and I think particularly with state governments, as Kushla touched on earlier. The states and territories in Australia have got a big role to play. They haven't been standing still. They've got all sorts of initiatives and commitments and things that they're doing. I'll refer to you. The Power Playbook's available online for those watching along or would like to download a copy. You're absolutely right. I mean, not surprisingly, workforce is a material part of what we think is needed to set Australia up to be a clean energy superpower and get us to our 82% target. We've touched on a number of the workforce-related recommendations already. Data and credible baseline information, understanding the skills gaps are critically important. A few we probably haven't mentioned, but revisiting the higher education funding models in Australia we think is really important, and I think Kushla's touched on some of the areas of progress that's already being made. There's certainly the vet sector. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of work to do, both in terms of the models, the funding models, but also I think the connection with industry to make sure that the programs and the training that's underway and being offered are very aligned to industry needs, and ultimately we're bringing people through in a way that they'll be of most valuable and find a place in the industry into the future. And then the final one I'll reference is, I guess, showcasing Australia as a great place to be. We know one of the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act was to draw people to the US, given the scale and incentives on the table, and we're on a journey, I think, to reflect as a nation how do we how do we balance the ledger as far as the IRA, but there's more we can do, I think, to showcase Australia as a great place to be and the career and professional opportunities in our fine nation.
I think that's one thing that's come through really clearly in the IEA's work, the CEC's work, and basically anything I've ever read about workforce development is that there's three pathways in. That is getting people out of school, so they finish the secondary school and they go into tertiary education, whether that's vocational or at the university level. There's stealing people from other sectors by reskilling them later on, and obviously that's something that we actively want to do with fossil fuel workers, but we also need to poach people from other sectors. And the last piece is migration. And I think, a lot of people have been talking to me about how we all need to get to net zero emissions, but the reality is countries are transitioning on different timelines. Which means we can have a global workforce, and there are plenty of young people around the world that will happily travel for work for some time. Indeed, our wind blade technician champion, Darren, is from the UK. He's lived in Australia for 9 years, but prior to that, he had lived and worked in every continent other than Antarctica, because there's just so much opportunity, and he's loved that life, and indeed he's now managing people that are doing exactly that. Which is a wider question for you, Kushla. You've obviously gone through the pure workforce development of how do we drive more people into apprenticeships to do trades, how do we make sure that we've got better education systems that are actually delivering those trades and that they're updating the training so that people are getting the latest and greatest in renewables and efficiency and they understand all of that. But within the wider context, the Australian government's committed to developing sectoral decarbonisation pathways as well as transition plans. And there's obviously a wider piece around workforce development around all of that. Can you give us a bit of a sense of how workforce development fits within the Commonwealth Government's wider net zero strategy and objectives?
That is a great question, and maybe it's a little bit too early, so I may not know all the details of that question. But as you were saying, Holly, we've talked a lot about the clean energy today, but that's just one of the sectors, energy and electricity, in terms of the sectoral decarbonisation plans. So, for example, there's an agriculture and land plan out there, and again, some of particularly on energy efficiency, but there's a whole lot of other skill base that we have. There's carbon market developers, a whole lot of different things in different areas. So I know this panel's about that, but we need the skills, the energy in all of the different sectors across there. The slightly different point, because I probably know this brief a little bit better, but that question of, we're at the COP, we're thinking about what's happening internationally, particularly in some of the emerging economies. Emerging economies also in the Pacific, but that sort of fundamental skills, and this goes to an inclusion agenda as well. But you hit the barriers of saying, well, how far can we get to going to renewables in our systems? And Kane, I think I've had the opportunity to drag you into a couple of meetings sometimes, but we're seeing in some countries, say in Samoa, where they're at 50% renewables penetration, and they're facing issues with their grid and the stability of that. And I just think in terms of, while we're looking kind of at the deficit question here, the skills base that we have and have developed is incredibly deep. And so then there's a different opportunity or responsibility in terms of how do you share, how do you build in other countries as well. And I think that is sort of a different sort of opportunity that we have.
Yeah, it's 100% not about our wealthier developed countries stealing people from around the world. It's about us, encouraging those people to come to our countries, learn from us. There are key things to learn from Canada, the US and Australia that can really help other countries develop, and that really does fit into that diversity, equity and inclusion piece. And also, just transition isn't just about, getting fossil fuel workers out of fossil fuel jobs. It's about building a better world where everybody, is more included and is more diverse and equitable. So really critically on that, Lisa, like getting down to it, some actual activities, workforce development programs that have worked well in the US. You've got a couple of members that have done some really interesting programs. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what has been working well in workforce development and in diversity, equity and inclusion?
Well, I mean, I think there's been an evolution. I mean, for many of our industries, they've always had very strong workforce programs working at the community level. Those would involve partnerships with universities, community colleges, high schools, you know, our prison system, our veterans. I mean, all of those things had been in place, but what I've seen that's changed, well, two things have changed. One is, as the markets have matured, the demand for those workers has only increased. And again, it's competing also with other sectors of the economy where skilled workers are needed. So demand has increased, so those programs needed to expand and evolve. And now we also have within our policies, we have a call to do that and show it, demonstrate it, and you know, be accountable to those programs if you would like to benefit from some of the policy supports that we have. So, you know, there's the market reality, and then there's the complementary policy support to encourage that expansion of opportunity. And again, not just about getting a worker to fill a specific job, but to make sure that the communities where you're working are getting direct benefit from that. So this is really transformational. But you know, I think an important point to make, and this goes back to the value of policy, is that if you want to have a robust and thriving workforce, you need to have market signals that last. You know, we had a period of time, say 10, 15 years ago, where we had an expansion of our renewable energy policies. And I remember going to you know, our trade conferences, and you know, we had over 100,000 workers in the wind industry, for example, at a period of time. This was a high bar. It's bigger now, of course, but this was like revolutionary. And then that policy support went away, and manufacturing plants closed in the sector, and those employees were let go. And it took us until like 2 or 3 years ago to build it back up to that level. So you need to have policy. That will send signals to the market and to businesses to expand their public-private partnerships that they may already have, and to ensure that they are thinking long-term for the workers and making those investments. You know, I don't want to, I'll stop. I had other points, but I don't want to dominate here.
Go for it.
I can't resist but to jump in on that one, because I agree. I mean, we've discussed a lot of programs and areas and initiatives that are really important in developing the workforce, but you know, in Australia over the last 15 or 20 years, I think it's been very evident that both developing the workforce and indeed the supply chain more widely, probably the most significant factor has been, on occasion, the lack of policy certainty, clear ambition and policy that will deliver it has undermined, I think, the development of a sustainable, strong workforce or supply chain. Or conversely, I think now we see a government where there is a clear vision, a strong ambition, and policy mechanisms to deliver it. That, I think, more than anything else, this might be controversial, anything else we've discussed this morning actually sends a signal to people who are considering this workforce that this is a safe place and the right place to come into, or for an employer to invest in training, reskilling, investing in their own workforce. They need that confidence in the bigger picture to be able to make those investments.
And it's exactly that. It's confidence on two levels for individuals to go, oh, I've thought about working, I've thought about making the switch into clean energy or the clean economy more broadly, and knowing that governments, like, that is the plan. There's targets, there's policies and programs in place. They go, okay, this is a secure job for many years, many decades to come. But more critically, thinking about industry, it gives business the confidence to go, we're going to invest in people, to not just reskill by poaching people from other sectors, but upskilling their own staff. So that's really critical that it definitely has been the case in the renewable sector in Australia, but also in the US. Which, Dan, more broadly, you obviously put a bucket load of case studies into the World Energy Employment Report. What's the best example over the last year? Like, what's the program or the policy that got you most excited from around the world for supporting workforce development?
Yeah, so there's many, many different cases on this. If I was to cherry pick a few, I think the apprenticeship stuff, and I'm so glad to hear that Australia is taking this approach, is so critical, especially for these vocational degrees that people need to be going to. The IRA places a huge emphasis on this, and they smartly link it to the eligibility for tax credit, so you get a much higher tax credit for those projects if you have an apprenticeship-based workforce. You also have a much higher tax credit if you make sure that that is you're hiring people who have labor union representation as well. So there's a lot of really what we call people-centered lenses on this policymaking to make sure that the outcomes of these new projects actually accumulate to the right people and accumulate to the right communities to help avoid is exactly what we talked about, this vacillation on energy policy, right? This long-term certainty is really important, and part of that is enlisting people around the world to say, hey, I have a job in this industry. I want to vote for that as well. And so that was really at the core of the IRA as well. I know it has global implications on how that was all structured, but I think that was sort of the domestic aspect of that was one of the key driving factors for that design. One thing I just wanted to turn to, because you mentioned EMDEs, this is, for many of them, the #1 issue. I was just in we've done, as the IA, we do work around the world. I was in a session in Uganda, in the Oman Pavilion, in places all around the world, even China, India. We are doing a great work with the Indian National Skills Development Council. And all of them, they view this as, if we are going to be pivoting to these new clean energy technologies, one, in a just transition, we need to be having those jobs for our people. We can't develop projects right now. We have a 4 times higher cost of capital to develop these projects around the world, in part because we don't have the companies, we don't have a proven track record, because we don't have the skills. And so many of them are looking for public-private partnerships. They're looking to the advanced economies to do exchanges on skills programs. How do we do capacity building? How do we make sure that we're having exchanges with our universities to cultivate this workforce? Because otherwise, it's really not a good transition for us. We're not getting the jobs benefits. They're accruing to those who have this leadership already. And I think that's the last point I would say is having a skilled workforce. If you think about industries, especially many energy industries, when they think about what are my priorities for choosing where I build a new factory, yes, tax credits, but also energy costs. And also very close behind that is, do I have a skilled workforce there? And you see many of these battery factories coming up where they are having to bring people over, especially from China, Japan, Korea, to set up those factories. About 20% of the workforce for any new factory would be coming from those globally, we see, to be able to start catalyzing this skills exchange. So if that's not happening between all economies and developing ones, we're not going to get the change we need. And at the IEA, we see that increasing emerging market investment in emerging market and developing economies and clean energy outside of China is the #1 barrier to reaching our 1.5 degree goals. If that doesn't happen, and that won't happen, if that doesn't happen, 1.5 is out, and it won't happen unless we focus on building skills there. So,
I really appreciate it when someone says that building skills around the world is the #1 barrier to achieving net zero emissions. I'm not a crazy person that's just like, yeah, this is how we can't get there. Which is, talking about that is making sure that we are skilling people around the world, particularly in emerging economies. But this is all about how do we attract people, which poses one final question before we take any questions from the floor, which is for Joanna. What role should organisations like Women in Renewable Energy play to encourage more women into the sector? And I ask this really explicitly. In Australia, only 3% of our electricians are female. About 20% of our engineers are female. And this is, it is a barrier that there are way more than 20% of women graduating with an engineering degree, but actually working as an engineer. We need people in the sector. So what roles should organisations like yours be playing to make sure that we are diverse, equitable and inclusive? And I mean that beyond just women. I mean that to supporting people from around the world in all ways.
That's a great question. So what I do at Wire, or what we do at Wire is really we want to partner with as many associations as we can. You heard me earlier say, we need to work together to solidify that message and get to that net zero. I partner from skilled trades to Energy Efficiency Canada to the government. I want all of us to play in the same sandbox, because if we're not, again, we're not working together. I can't stress enough that, if you go on my website, you'll see there's hundreds now of organizations that we partner, and we actually do joint events with them. We really make sure that we're engaged with them. We market each other's efforts. We make sure that, not only from the Canadian side, but from a global scale, people know that there are organizations such as WIRE, such as energy efficiency, skilled trades, and we promote them. We want to make sure that the younger generation knows that they have a platform to come to. We also are partnered with academias, and we have WIRE student chapters, so students start feeling comfortable as well, knowing that when they do enter the workforce, we are there to support them. We are there to make sure that their journey is being navigated, and we're able to educate them on the different skill sets and the different careers that are out there. And to me, the more we partner, the better we work together, and the better we are able to achieve net zero.
Partnerships, partnerships, partnerships has been a strong theme of COP28 in general, but definitely workforce development. How can we get industry and government to work together? With that, if there are any questions from the floor, we've got a few minutes, and I'm happy to just, for ease, I'll come out to you. I will come back.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sharing. My name is Hakim. I'm from Malaysia. We do green jobs for indigenous people in Malaysia. And one of the things that we focus on as an EPCC also, we train orang asli or indigenous people to become solar technicians, and then we hire them. But hearing what you guys have talked about, this is super inspiring because, hey, there's a potential for us to trade talent is one of them. So this question is not super well formed, but could you help me think about what kind of skills and specific jobs we might be able to develop here in Malaysia and bring them over to Australia and swap for the purpose of enriching their skill set so that they can come back and do even more. Right now what we're doing is a basic solar technician, but when we hear about things like the need for project managers and that kind of thing, could you help me think about what would be useful in moving this back and forth? Thank you.
There's definitely a bunch of you that could answer this. Who would like to jump in first? Go for it, Kane, and then I think Dan's keen afterwards.
I'm happy to say, I think there's a lot to learn. I think one of the observations is, I think it's to Kushla's earlier point. I mean, one of the areas that Australia is sort of leading the world is confronting one of our biggest challenges, and one of the biggest challenges in Australia has been connecting renewables up to the grid. What that's meant, I said, on one level that's been a major problem and a major challenge. On another level, it's meant that we've now developed some capability, and we've got people in Australia who have been at the front edge of that problem, who have got expertise that I think the rest of the world are in awe of, in some cases for all the wrong reasons, but are now in awe of. A lot of the big global energy businesses have actually set up their centre of excellence for grid connection in Australia because we've had to confront that problem. And those people are now taking that expertise around the world to share it, to make sure that other parts of their business and other countries can learn from that. So I think to your point, I mean, solar installers, grid engineers, power engineers, there's a whole wave of areas that I think we have a lot to learn in Australia from other countries like Malaysia, and indeed vice versa. So maybe happy to talk to you offline about what that might look like.
Go for it, Dan. I'm assuming Joanna and Lisa would also very happily have that chat because there's just as much exchange to happen, not just in the Asia Pacific, but around the world. Dan, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, no, I think just echoing on that, there's that one more format of exchange where countries and peer organizations, let's say utilities, come over and talk to their counterparts. This is a very helpful mode of exchange, and actually AMO and other folks had been very helpful in my time in China.
AMO is the Australian energy market operator.
So the regulator, The market
not the
operator. Thank you.
regulator?
And you guys have slightly differences. The market operator came over to China multiple times and worked with State Grid, Southern Grid, when I was working there. And it was a really fruitful exchange for them to learn as they set up markets. So this is one format of exchange. The other one, and I'm a little bit spitballing here, but in the US, we have a series of visas that are specifically targeted at this. And usually they're focused in areas where we have a hard time recruiting enough people locally. And one area that has been discussion globally is how do you open those up for clean energy and these new industries that we know are emerging. So if the J7 visa opened up opportunities for people to come over to work in those careers for 2 to 3 years and then come back with those skills. This sort of works through the university track as well, but these are some of the formats and channels that already exist in governance today that could be built on to really open it up to support the clean energy revolution. And I think that this is an element that I would love to see when the skills conversation goes to these high levels at COP, saying these are some of the ways in which we can facilitate this exchange of skills and help foster that capacity in developing markets. So really happy to hear about the program. I'm looking forward to chatting more.
And Kushla, I'm not meaning to pick on you right now, but the Australian government is in the midst of developing a migration white paper. The Australian government's also, critically gone, what's for workforce? There's 3 areas. One's net zero, one's the caring workforce, and one's AI, unsurprisingly. This is something that, of course, the Australian government is thinking about not just as us poaching people from around the world, but that opportunity for exchange and upskilling everyone together. Is that correct?
If there's one thing I've heard, it's getting that balance right, in terms of what's fair in a community or your country, but what's needed, how do you seed that into other parts? And so I do think there are opportunities in terms of energy transition partnerships, things that happen through the International Energy Agency, things that are happening bilaterally on the region. So I do think, that they are important questions that any government is going to look like, have I got the balance right?
Yep. Anything that Joanna or Lisa would like to add to this? You're good? Okay, that's fine. Noting the time, I'm going to end the session. Sorry if... Oh, okay, let's do one more question. Let's make it quick.
One more.
Do we have... You've got it. Go for it.
Safira Tangewuni from Fiji and the indigenous people. Looking at skilled workers, going to... for our young people to come in to do energy studies. Would you be able to consider the skill levels from the indigenous people that you have to see that you could include our young people from the Pacific who would like to come and do these skill level works so that you can put your entry qualifications to meet them? And plus, while you're processing that, this desalinization is the only thing can work with us, the small island nations, for our water. But we're talking about phasing out fossil fuel. Desalinization can only be achieved through this fossil fuel. How can we, what other energy, renewable energy can we bring in to the Pacific so that we still can turn our ocean into our fresh water? Thank you.
Awesome. So just noting the first question there critically around how we can support Indigenous people and Pacific Islanders with skilling. And I believe that both Joanna and Kushla have something to say to that. I don't know who's going first though, so ladies.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for your question. WIRE works very closely with the Indigenous communities, not only in Canada, but globally as well, to reinforce and make an impact. Most recently, Kane and I were talking about Australia hosted a Canadian delegation through ICE, Indigenous Clean Energy, with Chris Henderson attending. This is of utmost importance for Canada. We are in a phase of reconciliation where we need to ensure that Indigenous communities have and are involved in these projects. We need to involve, again, you heard me saying this before, we need all hands on deck. And we in Canada are making tremendous efforts to ensure that we are getting educated and we're listening very, very closely to make sure that there is impact in those remote areas where Indigenous communities are. And again, I want to, make sure that everyone's included in this conversation. So again, you've heard me say this again, collaboration, empowerment, net zero, and I'll stop there, but thank you.
And thank you for coming. And we do appreciate that. It is sort of like that fundamental question: how do we make this work? How do we make this work in our region in particular? I am thinking through, so the Pacific Islands Forum leaders, they've agreed to establish an energy commissioner, and in that area, there's a question of what will that mean to, we've been talking about tripling up renewables. What will it mean in Pacific Island countries to be able to do that, in terms of different pathways to going fossil fuel free? And I think that there's a really good opportunity that we could be a lot smarter in terms of how we're working together. Your really practical point in terms of, well, how do you make sure that the trade certificates would work? And so we had the interoperability between that. That's just fundamental. And I do think, just briefly, Australia is also developing a First Nations clean energy strategy. So that goes to both the ownership and benefits of the resources, but absolutely we'll be thinking about workforce skills. So again, we're doing that with our First Nations people, but I do think there's an opportunity to think about how that could also interact with Pacific Islands.
Thank you so much for the question, and indeed, thank you for attending. I love the fact that, it's not just Australians in the room. We've got people from the Pacific, we've got people from Asia more broadly, which are our near neighbours, but critically, we're all neighbours in this fight, and we all need to work together. So I just really want to thank Dan and Kushla and Kane and Joanna and Lisa for being here. I want to remind all of you that this is something that collectively we need to work on. There's some really interesting research in this space, from some post-COVID analysis from Lisa's organisation in the US, from the IEA's annual report. The Power Playbook obviously says how we're going to get there. And really critically, if you're thinking about something for opportunity and optimism, something like Careers for Net Zero, our campaign, It's Time to Move, is all about getting people excited. I'm just going to lightly pick on one of those people in the room right now. Frankie is one of our 10 champions. She's our policy advisor champion, and she's actively being a positive force out in the world alongside all of us that are working in this space to remind us that we can get there. There's a lot of work to do, and indeed, it is time to move. Thank you very much, everyone.